The day Amani signed the papers, she believed she was protecting what little remained of the life she and her husband had spent nearly 22 years building together. Every signature felt like another piece of her future slipping away, but she kept reminding herself that marriages were tested in different ways. Some couples faced illness. Others struggled with raising children or losing jobs. She believed their challenge was financial hardship, and she was determined to face it beside the man she had promised to stand with for better or worse. Her husband, Jabari, looked exhausted during those weeks. He barely slept, spent hours staring at spreadsheets on his laptop, and often left the house early, saying he was meeting with lawyers or financial advisors. Whenever Amani asked questions, he answered them with just enough detail to calm her fears without giving away too much. Looking back, she would realize that was one of his greatest talents. He never told a complete lie. He simply left out the parts that would have changed everything. The hardest conversation came when he told her they would have to sell their home. That house wasn't just a building. It was where they celebrated promotions, birthdays, anniversaries, and countless family gatherings. It was where they had planted a tree in the backyard the year they renewed their vows. Every room carried memories that couldn't be packed into moving boxes. Jabari sat across from her at the kitchen table with tears in his eyes. "I've tried everything," he said. "The investments failed. The debt is too much. If we don't sell now, we'll lose everything." Amani didn't argue. She reached across the table and held his hand. She told him they would get through it together because that's what families did. She had no idea that every comforting word she spoke was easing the guilt of a man who already knew exactly where the money had gone. The house sold faster than anyone expected. Friends told them they were lucky to receive such a good offer. Neighbors hugged them as the moving truck pulled away. Even strangers who watched from across the street probably assumed they were another family forced to make difficult choices during uncertain times. Only Jabari knew he wasn't leaving because he had no choice. He was leaving because the plan was already in motion. For Amani, the months that followed were filled with sacrifice. She picked up extra shifts at work, canceled every unnecessary expense, and convinced herself that temporary discomfort would eventually lead to a fresh start. Every paycheck went toward rebuilding their savings. Every dollar was carefully accounted for. Meanwhile, Jabari seemed strangely relaxed at first. She thought he was simply relieved that the worst was over. But there were little moments that didn't make sense. He bought new clothes, saying they were discounted. He upgraded his phone, claiming it came free with a promotion. He started smiling at text messages that he immediately deleted whenever she walked into the room. Individually, none of those things seemed unusual. Together, they painted a picture she refused to see. There was another person who remained close during all of this. Her younger sister, Nyla. If anyone had asked Amani who she trusted most after her husband, Nyla would have been the first name she mentioned. Nyla visited almost every weekend. She brought groceries when money was tight, helped unpack boxes in the apartment, and constantly reminded Amani that difficult seasons never lasted forever. Sometimes she stayed so long that Jabari would offer to drive her home after dinner. Amani thought nothing of it. She was grateful they cared about each other like family. That gratitude would eventually become one of the most painful memories she carried. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork for a tax appointment, Amani noticed something strange. A folder containing years of financial records was missing. She searched every box, every cabinet, every drawer, nothing. When she mentioned it to Jabari, he answered without even looking up from his phone. "I probably put it in storage by mistake." It sounded reasonable, until she remembered they hadn't rented a storage unit. She let it go anyway. People under stress forgot things all the time. Weeks passed. Then came the phone call that changed everything. An employee from their bank politely explained there was a question regarding one of the closed accounts connected to the proceeds from the sale of their home. Amani was confused. She didn't remember closing any accounts herself. She drove to the bank the very next morning, expecting to clear up a simple misunderstanding. Instead, she found herself staring at transaction records she had never seen before. Large transfers had been made months before the house was sold. Several withdrawals carried only electronic reference numbers. The destination accounts weren't familiar. Even stranger, some documents appeared to include her authorization, but the signatures didn't look like hers. She felt the room grow quiet. The banker assumed she already knew about the transactions. Amani forced herself to remain calm, thanked the employee, and walked out carrying copies of every available record. She sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine. There had to be an explanation. There always was. She rehearsed the conversation she would have with Jabari. He would explain everything, and there would be paperwork she hadn't seen. Perhaps an investment had been moved. Maybe the bank had made an error. Anything seemed more believable than the thoughts slowly forming in the back of her mind. When she finally confronted him that evening, Jabari barely glanced at the documents. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said the transfers were part of an emergency financial strategy his attorney had recommended before the sale. The explanation sounded complicated. Complicated enough that Amani felt embarrassed for questioning him. She apologized, and he accepted the apology with a reassuring smile. That smile stayed with her for days. Not because it comforted her, because, for the first time in their marriage, it didn't feel genuine. The answer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and if Amani had ignored her phone the way she usually did while getting ready for work, she might have stayed in the dark for weeks longer. The message came from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no explanation, just one sentence that made her stop breathing for a moment. You deserve to know what they're planning. Attached to the message were 3 photographs. The first showed Jabari sitting across from a woman in a quiet restaurant. The angle was distant, but his face was unmistakable. He was smiling in a way Amani hadn't seen in months. The second photograph was closer. The woman reached across the table, her hand resting on his. Amani felt her stomach tighten. She zoomed in, and the bracelet on the woman's wrist wasn't just familiar. She had bought it herself as a birthday gift nearly 4 years earlier. It belonged to Nyla. She stared at the picture so long that her coffee turned cold. No, she whispered to herself. There has to be another explanation. The third photograph was taken outside a downtown hotel. Jabari and Nyla were walking side by side. Neither of them looked worried about being seen. Neither looked guilty. They looked comfortable, like 2 people who had spent enough time together to stop pretending. Amani closed the images and immediately called Nyla. Her sister answered on the second ring. Hey sis. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost relieved to hear from her. I need to ask you something. Sure. Were you with Jabari yesterday? There was only a brief pause. No. The answer came too quickly. I've been busy all week. Amani closed her eyes. I have pictures. She kept silent, but not the silence of someone searching for words. The silence of someone deciding which lie to tell next. Finally, Nyla laughed softly. Pictures can make anything look suspicious. Amani wanted to believe that. She wanted someone to explain how photographs could lie. Instead, she asked one more question. Have you ever been alone with my husband without telling me? Another pause, then came the answer. Amani, you're imagining things because you've been under so much stress. The call ended a minute later. Amani sat perfectly still. She noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Nyla never actually denied loving Jabari. She only denied what could be proven. That evening, Jabari walked into the apartment carrying takeout from Amani's favorite restaurant. Normally, she would have smiled. Instead, she watched him as though she were seeing him for the first time. How many times had he walked through that same door after spending the afternoon with her sister? How many hugs had been rehearsed? How many apologies had been practiced? He noticed her expression immediately. Everything okay? She slid the printed photographs across the table. His smile disappeared. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he looked up. Who sent these? It wasn't the response she expected. He didn't ask where she found them. He didn't deny they were real. He wanted to know who had exposed him. Amani noticed that before he did. You know these pictures are real. He leaned back in his chair. You don't understand what's going on. Then help me understand. It's business. She almost laughed. Business. Your sister needed advice. In a hotel? There were meetings. At dinner. It wasn't what you think. Every answer created another question. Every explanation sounded weaker than the one before. Finally, Amani asked the question that mattered most. Are you having an affair with my sister? Jabari didn't answer. He stood up, walked toward the window, and folded his arms. That silence hurt more than any confession could have. She waited. 30 seconds. A full minute. Still nothing. The room suddenly felt smaller, and Amani realized she had spent years married to a man who could speak for hours about work, investments, sports, or politics, yet he couldn't say 2 simple words when his marriage depended on them. No or yes. Instead, he chose silence. That told her everything. She quietly picked up the photographs and returned them to the envelope. I think you should leave. He turned around. Amani, I said leave. He tried taking a step toward her. She stepped back. For the first time in their marriage, she looked at him without recognizing the man standing in front of her. He collected a small overnight bag and walked out without another word. The apartment door closed gently behind him. There was no shouting, no broken dishes, no dramatic farewell, just silence. The kind of silence that arrives after trust disappears. That night, sleep never came. Instead, Amani replayed years of memories inside her mind. Family cookouts, holiday dinners, vacation photographs, birthdays. She began noticing details she had overlooked before. Every time she worked late, Nyla somehow happened to visit. Whenever Jabari volunteered to drive her home, they always returned much later than expected. Sometimes they laughed about conversations Amani had never heard. At the time, She believed they were simply becoming close as brother and sister. Now, every memory carried a different meaning. The following morning, Amani made a decision she never imagined she would make. She hired a private investigator. She wasn't looking for revenge. She wanted the truth, whatever it cost. The investigator listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished explaining everything, he folded his hands across the desk. I need to ask you one question. She nodded. If I find proof that your husband and your sister have been deceiving you for years, do you want to know everything? Amani hesitated. Part of her wanted to stop right there. Some truths change a person's life forever. But living with unanswered questions was becoming even more painful. She took a slow breath. Yes. The investigator nodded once. Then prepare yourself. Amani frowned. For what? He looked directly into her eyes before answering. Because I don't think this story starts with an affair. He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. I think the affair was only one piece of a much bigger plan. The investigator's words echoed in Amani's mind long after she left his office. I don't think the affair was only one piece of a much bigger plan. She had spent days convincing herself that the greatest pain would be discovering her husband had fallen in love with someone else. As devastating as that was, there was a part of her that believed people made terrible choices every day. Affairs happened. Marriages ended. Hearts broke. But a plan? That was different. A plan required time, and it required patience. It required two people making the same decision over and over again, knowing exactly who would be hurt when the truth finally came out. For the next 2 weeks, Amani heard almost nothing. The investigator only called once. I'm still working. That was all he said before ending the conversation. Meanwhile, Jabari began reaching out almost every day. Sometimes he left voice messages. Sometimes he sent long texts. He apologized for keeping secrets. He admitted they had spent time together. He insisted there was an explanation. What he never denied was the relationship itself. Amani noticed something else. Not once did he ask how she was coping. Every message focused on protecting himself. Please don't tell anyone until we talk. You'll understand everything if you just hear me out. Don't make any decisions yet. She read every message without responding. Then one evening, another notification appeared on her phone. This time, it wasn't from Jabari. It was from Nyla. Can we meet? I don't want you hearing everything from someone else. Amani stared at the screen for several minutes before agreeing. They met at a quiet park they had visited countless times as children. For a moment, watching Nyla walk toward the bench almost made Amani forget everything. She still looked like the little sister she had spent years protecting. The little girl who cried whenever she scraped her knees. The teenager who borrowed her clothes without asking. The young woman Amani had defended whenever relatives criticized her life choices. Those memories disappeared the moment Nyla sat down. Neither of them spoke at first. Finally, Nyla broke the silence. I'm sorry. Amani waited. I never wanted it to happen like this. Those words landed harder than any confession. They weren't a denial. They were an admission. How long? Amani asked quietly. Nyla lowered her eyes. It started almost 3 years ago. Amani felt her chest tighten. 3 years. That meant the affair had begun while they were still living comfortably in their family home. Before the financial crisis. Before the sale. Before every sacrifice Amani believed they were making together. Did you ever think about me? Nyla's eyes filled with tears. Every day. That didn't stop you. No, the honesty was almost cruel. Amani asked another question. When you came to help me pack after we sold the house, were the two of you already together? Nyla nodded. Amani looked away. She suddenly remembered her sister wrapping delicate dishes in newspaper while reassuring her that brighter days were ahead. Every comforting hug, every encouraging smile, every promise that things would get better. All of it had come from someone who already knew why everything had fallen apart. What about the money? For the first time, Nyla looked genuinely confused. What money? The money from the house. I don't know anything about that. Amani studied her carefully. This answer felt different. There was no hesitation. No carefully chosen words. Just confusion. What do you mean you don't know? I thought he really lost everything. Now it was Amani's turn to be surprised. You believed him too? Nyla slowly nodded. He told me he needed a fresh start. He said the marriage had already been over for years. Amani almost laughed through her tears. The same man had told 2 completely different stories. To his wife, he was a loyal husband trying to save their future. To her sister, he was trapped in a marriage that had ended long ago. Neither story matched the facts. Before Amani could ask another question, her phone rang. It was the investigator. I've finished. His voice was calm. When can you meet? Right now. An hour later, Amani sat across from him in the same office where their journey had begun. A thick file rested on his desk. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked directly at her. What I'm about to show you isn't easy. She nodded. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank records, property documents, corporate filings, and email records obtained through legal channels. He pointed to the first document. This account received several transfers from the proceeds of your home. She recognized the account number immediately. It matched the records she had collected at the bank. Who owns it? The investigator slid another document across the desk. A limited liability company. She frowned. I've never heard of it. That's because it doesn't operate under your family's name. He turned another page. The company was formed 8 months before your house was listed for sale. Amani's heartbeat quickened. Who owns the company? The investigator remained silent for a moment. Then he answered. Officially, your husband. He flipped another page. But that's not the whole story. Another name appeared beneath Jabari's. Not Nyla. Someone Amani had never met. A business partner. According to the records, the company had quietly purchased investment properties in 3 different cities while Amani believed her family was drowning in debt. The sale of their home had never been about paying creditors. It had been used to finance an entirely new life. Amani could barely speak. So, we were never broke. The investigator slowly shook his head. No, the investments never failed. I couldn't find any evidence they failed. The investigator handed her one final document. This is the part one think you should read yourself. It was a draft prenuptial agreement. The names at the top froze her where she sat. Groom, Jabari. Bride, Nyla. The document had been prepared almost 4 months before Amani signed the papers to sell the family home. For months. That meant while she was still praying every night for their marriage. Her husband had already been preparing to marry her sister. Amani stared at the page until the words became blurred by tears. The investigator quietly closed the folder. There is one more thing, she looked up. I believe your husband assumed no one would ever connect the financial records. He paused. But after reviewing everything, he slid one final report across the desk. I believe several of these transactions may amount to financial fraud. Amani left the investigator's office carrying a folder that felt heavier than anything she had ever held before. It wasn't the weight of the paper. It was the weight of the truth. She drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. Her phone vibrated several times, but she ignored it. Nothing anyone could say at that moment would change what she had just learned. Once inside her apartment, she spread every document across the dining table. Bank statements, property records, company filings, transfer receipts. One by one, she compared them with the paperwork she still had from the sale of the family home. The dates lined up perfectly. The account that received the money from the house was connected to the company Jabari had secretly established months earlier. He hadn't made desperate decisions. He had made calculated ones. As she continued reading, another detail caught her attention. Several signatures appeared beside her name. She leaned closer. Those signatures looked enough like hers that someone glancing quickly might never notice the difference. But Amani knew every curve of her own handwriting. She had signed thousands of documents throughout her career. Those signatures weren't hers. Someone had signed her name. She immediately called the investigator. I think he forged my signature. There was a brief silence before he replied. I noticed the same thing. I wanted a handwriting specialist to review the documents before saying anything. And the preliminary opinion is that multiple signatures were likely written by the same person. Amani slowly sat down. So he didn't just lie to me. No, he signed my name. That's what the evidence suggests. She thanked him before ending the call. For several minutes, she simply stared at the papers. The affair had broken her heart. The forged signatures shattered whatever remained of her trust. The next morning, she scheduled a meeting with an attorney recommended by the investigator. Unlike the emotional conversations she'd been having for weeks, this meeting focused entirely on facts. The attorney reviewed every document without interruption. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious. Mrs. Reynolds, if these records are authentic, this is no longer just a divorce matter. Amani swallowed. What does that mean? It means there may be civil and criminal issues involved. Hidden assets, forged documents, financial misrepresentation. Those are very serious allegations. He continued flipping through the file. You said your husband told you the proceeds from your home were used to satisfy debts? Yes. According to these records, a substantial portion of those funds was transferred into accounts connected to investment properties. So he lied. The documents certainly don't support the explanation he gave you. The attorney closed the file. The first thing we're going to do is make sure those assets can't quietly disappear. 3 days later, Jabari asked to meet. Against her attorney's advice, Amani agreed. She wanted to hear what he would say now that she knew the truth. They met at a quiet cafe across town. Jabari arrived early. He stood as she approached, but she remained standing. I don't have much time. He nodded. I know you're angry. I'm past angry. He lowered his eyes. I made mistakes. He sighed. I never wanted you to get hurt. Amani couldn't believe what she was hearing. You sold our home. He stayed silent. You emptied our accounts. You let me believe we were broke. Still nothing. You let me work overtime while you were buying property with the money. His shoulders slumped. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. She looked at him in disbelief. Then how was it supposed to happen? He opened his mouth but couldn't answer. For the first time since they met, Jabari had no story prepared. Amani reached into her bag and placed copies of the company records on the table. His face changed immediately. Then she placed the report about the forged signatures beside them. The color drained from his face. You've been busy. No, Amani replied calmly. I've been learning the truth. He looked around the cafe before lowering his voice. We can work this out. She almost smiled. Can we? I'll transfer everything back. So you admit it belongs to me? He froze. The question had caught him off guard. She continued. You've spent months denying everything. Now you're offering to return something you claimed never existed. He rubbed his forehead. I was scared. You weren't scared when you watched me pack up 22 years of memories. I know. You weren't scared when you looked me in the eye and told me we'd lost everything. I know. You weren't scared when you let my own sister comfort me while the two of you were planning a wedding. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. Amani looked at him for a long moment. Months earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they meant almost nothing. I'm sure you are. She gathered her papers and stood. Before walking away, she turned back one last time. I spent months asking myself what I did wrong. Jabari looked up. I finally found the answer. I trusted someone who had already stopped deserving it. Without another word, she walked out of the cafe. She never looked back. 2 weeks later, just as the case was beginning to gain momentum, her attorney called with unexpected news. You should sit down. Her heart began racing. What happened? We received a subpoena response this morning. And it confirms the company purchased another property. Amani frowned. I thought there were only 3. There were. He paused. This one was purchased just 6 weeks ago. With what money? Another pause. The remaining proceeds from the sale of your home. Amani closed her eyes even after being exposed, even after the photographs, even after the affair, even after she confronted him. Jabari had continued using money that never should have been his alone. The betrayal hadn't ended. It had simply become more expensive. The discovery of the 4th property changed everything. Until then, Amani had believed Jabari's deception had finally reached its limit. She assumed that once he realized the truth was catching up to him, he would stop trying to protect what he had built with money that should never have been his alone. Instead, the records showed something completely different. Over the next several weeks, the legal team worked tirelessly. Subpoenas were sent to financial institutions, property records were reviewed, tax filings were compared against bank transfers. Every new document seemed to uncover another layer of deception. Then the handwriting expert submitted the final report. The attorney handed Amani a copy that you'll want to read the conclusion. She skipped to the final page. According to the examiner, there was strong evidence that multiple signatures attributed to Amani had been written by the same individual, and the characteristics of those signatures were inconsistent with genuine samples she had provided. She placed the report back on the table to oh, it wasn't just my imagination. No, and if the court accepts this, it significantly strengthens your case. For the first time in months, Amani felt the balance beginning to shift. The lies that had once existed only inside her home were now supported by records, reports, and expert opinions. Facts didn't depend on emotions. Facts didn't change because someone told a convincing story. A few days later, another unexpected phone call came. This time it was from Nyla. Amani almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered. I don't have much to say. I know, Nyla replied quietly. I need you to hear me. Amani remained silent. He lied to me too. Those words caught her off guard. What do you mean? He told me the divorce had already been finalized months before it actually was. Amani closed her eyes. He said you were only staying together because of paperwork. She didn't respond. He told me the properties belonged to his business partner. Again, silenced. I didn't know he used money from your house. Amani finally spoke. Whether you knew about the money or not, you knew he was still my husband. I know. You sat in my apartment. I know. You hugged me while I cried. I know. You looked me in the eyes and told me everything would be okay. On the other end of the line, Nyla began sobbing. I wish I could take it back. So do I. The conversation ended without forgiveness. Some wounds heal slowly. Others leave scars that become part of a person's story forever. 1 week later, the court held its first major hearing. Jabari entered the courtroom wearing the same confident expression Amani had seen for years whenever he believed he was in control. That confidence lasted only until the judge reviewed the first set of financial records. Questions came quickly. Why were marital assets transferred without full disclosure? Why were company accounts opened while shared finances were supposedly collapsing? Why did multiple documents contain signatures now being challenged by a forensic examiner? Jabari's attorney requested additional time to respond. The judge granted a short extension but ordered that the disputed properties remain under court supervision until the financial issues were resolved. As the hearing ended, Jabari glanced toward Amani. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't look confident. He looked worried. Amani didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply walked out of the courthouse with her attorney beside her, knowing the truth no longer depended on her word against his. It was written in contracts, bank statements, emails, and official records. And the closer the court looked, the harder those facts became to explain. The following week, her attorney called with another update. We've received the disclosure package from Jabari's legal team. Were they honest this time? There was a brief pause. They disclosed more than before. But not everything. No, Amani had expected as much. What are they still hiding? We're not certain yet. But there are references to accounts that don't appear anywhere in the supporting documents. So there are more records. I believe so. Amani leaned back in her chair. Every answer seemed to uncover another unanswered question. Later that evening, she opened an old storage box she hadn't touched since moving out of the family home. Inside were greeting cards, photo albums, and faded envelopes from years earlier. She wasn't searching for evidence. She was searching for herself. Somewhere beneath the betrayal, the legal paperwork, and the endless meetings, she wanted to remember who she had been before her life became a case file. As she turned the pages of one photo album, she stopped at a picture taken nearly 10 years earlier. She, Jabari, and Nyla stood together in the backyard during a summer cookout. Everyone was smiling. At first, she almost closed the album. Then she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Jabari wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Nyla. It might have meant nothing. Or it might have meant everything. She gently closed the album. Some questions no longer mattered. The next morning, her attorney arranged another meeting. I think you'll want to hear this in person. When she arrived, several folders were already spread across the conference table. Her attorney pointed to a timeline. We've reconstructed the financial activity leading up to the sale of your home. He traced his finger across the dates. The company was formed. A few months later, the first transfers began. Then, the property was listed. Finally, the sale closed. Amani followed the sequence carefully. It was all planned. That's what the records suggest. He handed her another document. This is interesting. It was an email between Jabari and his business associate discussing renovation estimates for one of the investment properties. The date caught her attention immediately. It had been sent the same afternoon. Jabari sat beside her on the couch, holding her hand while telling her they might lose everything. She remembered that day vividly. She had cried for hours. He had comforted her. And only hours earlier, he had been discussing renovation budgets. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. Her attorney folded his hands. There's something else. Amani looked up. We've received notice that Jabari wants to negotiate. She frowned. Negotiate what? A settlement. So suddenly? He appears eager to avoid a lengthy trial. Amani thought about that for a moment. Months ago, he denied nearly everything. Now he wanted to settle. What changed? Her attorney slid another envelope toward her. Inside was a letter from Jabari's legal team. According to the proposal, Jabari was willing to transfer ownership of 2 investment properties, pay a substantial financial settlement, and waive any future claim to shared assets if Amani agreed to resolve the dispute privately. She finished reading and quietly placed the letter back into the envelope. He isn't doing this because he's sorry. No, he's afraid. Her attorney nodded. That would be my assessment. Amani looked out the office window. For the first time since discovering the affair, she realized something important. She no longer needed an apology. She no longer needed an explanation. She didn't even need him to admit every lie. The evidence had already spoken. The only decision left was whether she would accept a settlement or continue until every unanswered question had been addressed in court. As she gathered her belongings, her attorney's phone rang. He answered, listened for a few moments, then slowly looked at Amani. The judge has scheduled another hearing. She waited. There has been a new filing. From Jabari? No. He lowered the phone. It's from someone you've never met. Amani's heart skipped a beat. Who? The business partner. She frowned. What does he want? Her attorney's expression grew serious. According to the filing, he's prepared to testify. Amani stared at him in disbelief. About what? He claims there are conversations and records that neither side has seen yet. The room fell silent. If what the business partner was saying was true, the biggest revelation in the entire case might still be waiting to come to light. The courtroom was quieter than usual on the morning of the next hearing. Amani noticed it the moment she walked inside. Lawyers whispered among themselves. Court staff moved with the same routine efficiency as always. Yet there was a feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Her attorney leaned toward her. The business partner has agreed to testify voluntarily. Why would he do that now? He requested limited legal protection in exchange for cooperating. That usually means one thing. What? He believes telling the truth is safer than continuing to keep secrets. Amani nodded slowly. Across the room, Jabari sat beside his attorney. That he looked different. His tailored suits were still expensive. His posture was still straight. But the confidence that had carried him through the first hearings had disappeared. For the first time since all of this began, he looked like a man who knew he was running out of answers. When the proceedings began, the judge called the next witness. The business partner walked to the stand, took the oath, and settled into his seat. After a few introductory questions, Amani's attorney approached. Please state your relationship with Mr. Jabari. We formed a real estate investment company together. How long had you known him? Almost 6 years. Were you familiar with the source of the company's startup funds? Yes. And what was that source? The sale of his marital home. Amani closed her eyes for a brief moment. Hearing it spoken aloud in open court somehow made it feel even more real. Her attorney continued. Did Mr. Jabari ever tell you his wife had approved that arrangement? Yes. Did you ever verify that yourself? No. The attorney walked a few steps before asking the next question. At any point, did Mr. Jabari discuss his marriage with you? The witness hesitated. Yes. What did he say? He said he intended to leave the marriage after moving the assets. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. He said the timing mattered. What did he mean by that? He believed if everything was transferred first, there would be less to divide later. Amani felt her attorney gently place a reassuring hand on her shoulder before continuing. Did he ever mention another woman? Yes. Who? My understanding was that he planned to marry his wife's sister. A few people in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. The judge reminded everyone to remain silent. The testimony continued for nearly an hour. Some answers confirmed what Amani already knew. Others revealed details she had never imagined. According to the witness, Jabari often described himself as being 2 steps ahead. He believed every document had been prepared carefully enough to avoid questions. He believed Amani trusted him too much to investigate. Most of all, he believed that by the time anyone realized what had happened, the money would already be beyond reach. He had underestimated one thing: persistence. After the witness stepped down, the judge announced a short recess. Amani walked into the hallway, trying to process everything she had heard. Her attorney joined her a few moments later. How are you? Holding up. I don't know. You've heard a lot today. I keep thinking about something. What? He planned every financial decision. That's what the testimony suggests. But he couldn't possibly have planned everything. Her attorney looked at her curiously. What do you mean? He couldn't have planned that someone would eventually decide to tell the truth. The attorney smiled faintly. Most carefully built lies eventually depend on people staying silent. Before Amani could respond, someone called her name. She turned around. It was Nyla. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying. She approached cautiously, stopping several feet away. That I know you probably don't want to see me. Amani didn't answer that I came because there's something you deserve to hear from me, not from another witness. Amani folded her arms. I'm listening. Nyla took a deep breath. I ended the relationship. Amani remained expressionless. When? The day I realized the money came from your house. And you expect that to change something? No, then why tell me? Because I spent months convincing myself that I had fallen in love. She lowered her head. But love doesn't ask someone to destroy another person's life. For the first time, Amani didn't hear excuses. She heard regret. Real regret. It didn't erase the betrayal. That it didn't restore their relationship. But it sounded different from every conversation they had shared since the truth came out. Nyla reached into her handbag and removed a small envelope. That I found this while packing my apartment. She handed it to Amani. What is it? I think it belongs in your attorney's hands. Without opening it, Amani looked at her sister. What's inside? Nyla swallowed. Printouts of emails. Between you and Jabari? She slowly shook her head. No, then who? Between Jabari and someone he thought would never speak. Amani frowned. The business partner? No. She paused, fighting back tears. His accountant. Amani stared at the envelope. If those emails contained what Nyla believed they did, they could answer the final questions surrounding the missing money. As the bailiff announced that court was back in session, Amani looked once more at her sister. She still couldn't forgive her. Perhaps she never would. Amani arrived at her attorney's office carrying the unopened envelope Nyla had given her outside the courthouse. She hadn't looked inside. Part of her wanted to know immediately. Another part feared that every new piece of evidence would uncover another lie she wasn't prepared to face. Her attorney examined the envelope carefully before opening it. Inside were dozens of printed emails arranged in chronological order. At first, they appeared ordinary: property discussions, tax questions, closing dates, wire transfer confirmations. Then the tone changed. One message from Jabari to his accountant read, "Make sure none of the transfers appear connected to the marital accounts. I don't want unnecessary questions during the divorce." The attorney looked up. "This is significant." He continued reading. Another email discussed delaying certain financial disclosures until after everything was finalized. There was no mention of Amani by name, but there didn't need to be. The timeline spoke for itself. The attorney carefully placed the papers back into the folder. If these emails can be authenticated, they may become some of the strongest evidence we've seen. Amani sat quietly. She had stopped feeling shocked. Each new discovery no longer surprised her. Instead, it confirmed what she had slowly come to accept. The life she believed she had been living had existed only in her heart. 1.3 days later, both sides returned to court. This hearing was different. NO reporters crowded the hallway. NO whispered conversations filled the courtroom. Everyone seemed to understand the case had reached its turning point. After reviewing the newly submitted evidence, the judge addressed both legal teams. The court has reviewed the additional financial records, electronic correspondence, and expert reports submitted since the previous hearing. He paused before continuing. Several issues raised by these documents require further examination. Jabari remained expressionless. His attorney quietly took notes. Then came the question no one appeared prepared for. The judge looked directly toward Jabari. "Would you like an opportunity to address the court regarding these matters before we proceed further?" The courtroom fell silent. For several seconds, Jabari didn't move. Finally, he stood. His attorney leaned toward him as if advising against it. Jabari nodded politely and walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked older than he had only a few months earlier. The confidence that once defined him had completely disappeared. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "I made decisions that hurt people." He stopped. No one interrupted. "I convinced myself I could separate business from family." He swallowed. "I was wrong." Amani listened without reacting. He continued. "I told myself that once everything settled, I would explain it." Another pause. "But every lie required another lie." His words hung in the air. "The longer I waited, the harder it became to tell the truth." For a brief moment, Amani almost recognized the man she had married. Then he said something that reminded her how much had changed. "I never intended for things to go this far." She lowered her eyes. Intentions no longer mattered. Choices did. After Jabari returned to his seat, the hearing continued. The judge reviewed the evidence for nearly an hour before announcing his decision on several pending motions. The disputed investment properties would remain under court supervision. Additional financial records would be produced. Independent accountants would review every transaction connected to the company. No assets could be transferred without court approval. As everyone began gathering their belongings, Amani's attorney leaned toward her. "That's a very important ruling." She nodded. "It means he can't move anything else." Exactly. For the first time since this nightmare began, the money wasn't disappearing faster than they could follow it. It was finally standing still. Weeks passed while accountants completed their review. Life gradually became quieter. Amani returned to work. She spent weekends visiting friends she hadn't seen in months. She began taking morning walks again. Little by little, routines that once seemed impossible started feeling normal. Healing didn't happen all at once. It arrived in small moments. Sleeping through the night, laughing without feeling guilty, making plans that didn't involve lawyers or court dates. One afternoon, her attorney called again. "The forensic accounting report is finished." She smiled faintly. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. When she arrived, he handed her the final report. The first page summarized months of investigation. Funds from the sale of the marital home had been traced through multiple accounts before being used to purchase investment properties and finance business activities. Every major transaction had now been accounted for. Nothing was missing anymore. The mystery that had haunted Amani for nearly a year finally had answers. Her attorney closed the report. "There's one final hearing next month. And after that, the court will decide how everything is divided." Amani stood and walked toward the window. As she prepared to leave, her attorney smiled. "I have a feeling next month's hearing will finally close this chapter." Amani looked down at the thick case file resting on his desk. "It may close the case." She paused before quietly adding, "But learning to live after betrayal." She offered a small, determined smile. "That's the chapter I'm just beginning." The morning of the final hearing arrived with clear skies, but Amani barely noticed. She stood outside the courthouse for a moment, taking a deep breath before walking through the front doors. Nearly a year had passed since she first believed she and Jabari were simply facing financial hardship. That woman no longer existed. She had entered this journey believing she needed answers. Now she understood she had needed the truth. Inside the courtroom, everyone took their seats one last time. Jabari sat quietly beside his attorney. Nyla was seated several rows behind him. She kept her eyes lowered, avoiding everyone around her. The judge entered, reviewed the case file for several moments, and began speaking. This matter has involved extensive financial review, expert testimony, documentary evidence, and disclosures from multiple parties. He paused. The court's responsibility is to determine an equitable resolution based on the evidence presented. Amani folded her hands together and listened. The judge carefully summarized months of findings. The hidden company, the undisclosed assets, the proceeds from the sale of the marital home, the question signatures, the failure to fully disclose financial information. Each finding was read into the record with the same calm, measured tone. There was no anger, no dramatic speeches, just facts. When the judge finished reviewing the evidence, he announced his decision. The disputed investment properties would be divided according to the court's findings. A substantial portion of the recovered assets would be awarded to Amani. Additional financial adjustments would be made to account for assets that had been concealed during the marriage. Certain matters involving the question signatures and financial documents would remain available for review by the appropriate authorities if they chose to pursue them separately. As the ruling concluded, Amani didn't celebrate. She simply closed her eyes for a brief second. For months, she had imagined this day. She expected relief. Instead, what she felt was peace. Her attorney leaned over with a quiet smile. "It's over," Amani nodded. Yes, but she knew something he didn't. The legal case was over. The healing had only just begun. Outside the courthouse,
Amani, how do you feel about the verdict? We are very pleased with the outcome today.
What is your next step?
Now I'm going home to rest.
Do you forgive your husband? What would you say to your sister? Amani stopped walking. For the first time since this nightmare began, she chose to answer. I've spent enough time talking about betrayal. The reporters grew quiet. Today, I'd rather talk about recovery. She continued walking before turning back one final time. That if you're watching this, and someone has convinced you that asking questions makes you disloyal. She paused. It doesn't. If something doesn't make sense, don't ignore it because you're afraid of the answer. Then she smiled politely and left. Weeks later, workers arrived at the house Amani had purchased with part of the recovered settlement. It wasn't as large as the home she had lost. It didn't need to be. Every room represented something she had earned honestly. She planted flowers along the front walkway herself. She painted the living room the color she had always wanted, but had never chosen because someone else preferred darker walls. For the first time in years, every decision belonged to her. One Saturday afternoon, a delivery arrived. There was no return address. Inside was a small wooden box. Amani opened it carefully. Resting inside was the silver house key from the home she and Jabari had sold. She immediately recognized it. Beneath the key lay a handwritten note. I found this while cleaning out my apartment. It belongs to the person who truly built that home. I'm sorry for every day I helped take your peace away. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you find happiness again. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Amani quietly closed the box. She walked outside into her backyard. Without saying a word, she buried the old key beneath a young oak tree she had planted earlier that spring. Some memories deserve to be remembered. Others deserve to be laid to rest. Nearly 18 months after the case ended, Amani received another unexpected call. It was from an old mutual friend. I thought you should know. What happened? Jabari moved away. She listened quietly. The business dissolved. And Nyla? I heard they haven't spoken in months. After the call ended, Amani sat on her back porch watching the evening sun disappear behind the trees. There was a time when hearing news like that would have made her feel satisfied. Instead, she felt nothing. The greatest revenge wasn't watching the people who hurt her lose everything. It was realizing she no longer measured her happiness by what happened to them. Her life had finally become her own again. She looked around her quiet backyard. The wind moved gently through the branches of the young oak tree. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A neighbor waved as he walked his dog. Ordinary moments. The kind she once overlooked. Now they meant everything. Sometimes people think losing a marriage is the end of a story. Sometimes losing a house feels like losing your future. Sometimes betrayal convinces you that you'll never trust another person again. But the truth is this. The people who betray you don't get to decide how your story ends. They only decide the chapter they appear in. You decide everything that comes after. If this story taught us anything, it's that trust should never require silence. Love should never demand blindness. And the truth has a way of reaching the surface, no matter how carefully it's buried. Now we'd love to hear from you that if you were in Amani's position, could you ever forgive either Jabari or Nyla? Or do you believe some betrayals leave wounds that can never fully heal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read as many of them as we can, and your perspective could encourage someone else who's facing a difficult season in their own life. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story of betrayal, resilience, and justice. Until next time, thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the ending you never wanted becomes the beginning you never knew you needed.